our most esteemed speaker tonight. We are so grateful for you for being here. Now, before I pass you to tonight's host, Mike Woodward, who will introduce Dr. Rowan properly, I just want to give a very short word of introduction about the lay community for those of you who don't know us. So we were founded 53 years ago by the monks of Worth Abbey. We are lay-led and intergenerational. We are ecumenical and we are inclusive. We count 230 members and seekers. Our hope, which is really the purpose of St. Benedict Week, as well as so much of our life of prayer and community, is to help create a new generation of fans of St. Benedict in the company of other lovers of his way. This is the second of our talks to mark St. Benedict Week, which runs from the 6th to the 14th of July, encompassing the feast on the 11th of July. So please do feast on the blogs, podcasts and talks from so many in the Benedictine world to mark this week. I'm now going to pass you over to Mike Woodward, our host for tonight.
Thank you. Thank you, Adam. So, Rowan Williams, 104th Archbishop of Canterbury.
Oh, that's wonderful.
And theologian, author of, I looked it up, 258 books. No introduction from me. However, I will just briefly highlight a few attributes. In Wales, we are very grateful to have redeemed the unprecedented long-term loan that translated him from being, he was originally first bishop, he was Bishop of Monmouth and then Archbishop of Wales, to the senior English see. This upward trajectory was in harmony with his later final promotion after some vacillation from Oxenford to the sunlit uplands of Cambridge, the culmination and apotheosis of a stellar academic career. But seriously, Rowan's lifelong commitment to building and enhancing church life in a way suiting our very different age puts him in direct succession to the noble lineage of Saints Tylo, Cadder, Hilted, and Cadfan. His assiduous ministry to the contemplative nuns at Timauer as their warden is emblematic of this. And Rowan's generosity in providing helpful introductions and comments for new books and authors is well known, and I am personally grateful for both. Did I mention noble? Just a word on the choice of Oystermouth for his barony. The local Swansea reference is the obvious point, but surely there is some alloy of grace and serendipity also in process here. Just stay with me a moment. Wales has never wanted for or been unduly swayed by gold, having its own abundant supply. Pearls are another matter. Rowan's achievement, I believe, as a late, as opposed to an early, church father will be recognized in due course. And he can sit comfortably alongside the cherished golden tongue, John Chrysologus, and the brilliant golden mouth, John Chrysostom, as a pearl. But why are we gathered here now this evening? Well, stumbling upon a shared interest in the fascinating, compelling figure that is Madeleine Delbrêl, so relevant to this week's theme that the community is pursuing, led to Rowan's gracious acceptance of an invitation to join us this evening and open up a way into appreciating a woman of not only established significance for 20th century church and social history in France, but also, I think, huge as yet untapped potential for illuminating creative pathways for living the gospel in our own troubled time. And I'm so looking forward to hearing what Rowan is going to share. As you know, Rowan, we have a custom in the community of praying for our speakers before they begin. So we'll just do that now, and I'll invite Adam and Christine to join in that, please. Father, we thank you, we praise you, and we bless you, and We ask you to bless especially our dear brother Rowan this evening, and that you will give him the wisdom, the words, and the perspective that he needs to share with us, someone who is so close to your heart and so dear to him. And we ask you to bless him and his family. And we thank you for all he means to so many people. Through Christ our Lord. Amen. So, Rowan, please, over to you.
Thank you so much, Michael, and thank you all for the opportunity to be with you this evening. And I'm particularly delighted to have the opportunity of speaking about Madeleine Delbrêl. As you'll see, her work and her witness are not just relevant generally to our Christian life in the world today. I think they have some special insights to offer on the Benedictine path, although it wasn't the one that Madeleine herself followed. Thanks to Michael, a little bit of information has gone round about Madeleine, including that photograph of her, Michael, which you circulated, which I have to say is one of my very favourite photographs of her, squatting down, intently giving her full presence to this little refugee girl. And when a couple of years ago I was asked by the New Statesman to choose my favourite photograph, I went for that without any hesitation at all. Anyway, you'll have had the basic outline of her life, and so just a word of reminder about that. She lived from 1904 to 1964, dying relatively young by 20th century standards. And for the last 31 years of her life, she lived in Ivry-sur-Seine, a suburb of Paris, and in her own day, an area of real social deprivation and conflict, an area with a strongly communist and anti-clerical administration. It says quite a lot for her that in that unwelcoming climate, she became effectively the director of social services for that area during and after the war period. She trained as a social worker, and part of her formation was also, rather surprisingly, in the French Girl Guide movement. But scrolling back a bit, all of that is almost equally improbable when you look at the background from which she came. She came from a fairly determinedly non-religious background, and certainly by the time she was a teenager, and she was obviously an extremely bouncy, argumentative, and bolshy teenager, by the time she was a teenager, she had settled very definitely for the path of atheism, and famously wrote a poem in her teenage years celebrating the death of God. God is dead, long live death, she wrote when she was about 16. Her poetry writing was a very significant part of her witness, and she won an award for her poetry at a very young age. And that, Michael, I think you're familiar with some of that, and you very kindly presented me with a volume of those early poems. But during her late teens and early 20s, she was going through an enormous mental and spiritual upheaval, which seems to be triggered mostly by the fact that her fiancé, like her, a good secularist of the best French variety, had suddenly decided to become a Catholic and a Dominican friar. And that was a bit of a shock to the system. Madeleine asked herself what could conceivably be attractive or compelling about a system of thought and a way of life like that. And rather to her own surprise, and very much to the surprise of her friends, she discovered the answer. So she herself entered the church and initially tested her vocation in a Carmelite convent. That didn't last a very long time, which is not entirely surprising, because I don't think she was one of nature's nuns. She was, for example, somebody who greatly enjoyed designing and making her own clothes. And early and late photographs, show the results of this. Not a conventional and not a mousy person in the least. But she was clearly somebody who committed herself totally to anything which she was involved in. And that meant for her, during her 20s, first of all, her work for the Girl Guide movement, because she was determined to do what she could for particularly deprived young people in the urban environment of Paris and surrounding areas. But as time went on, she became more and more convinced that what she was trying to offer for these young women was not quite enough. The Girl Guide movement was all very well as far as it went. It instilled a certain amount of discipline, a certain sense of value, but there was a spiritual depth to which it didn't really reach. And that was the depth in which she was more and more feeling herself to be at home. Her prayer life was intense and very profound. Fortunately, she met a couple of priests who took her seriously, encouraged her contemplative vocation, and encouraged her to think about pursuing that contemplative vocation in the world. Initially, her idea was, having moved on from the Girl Guide movement, her idea was to settle in a troubled urban area with a couple of other young women under semi-formal vows of poverty and celibacy, and to offer their services basically to the life of the local parish. She was at the heart of a network which she'd helped to foster, called simply the Charité de Jésus, the love of Jesus. A network in which people were encouraged to take promises of a shared prayer life and a discipline of poverty and celibacy. But she was very keen that there should be also some kind of tangible community life. So she and a couple of other young women moved into a house in Ivry, and they began their ministry. At the time, the main parish church in Ivry was a long way from the most troubled and challenging housing developments. And needless to say, Madeleine and her colleagues headed for the most troubling and challenging housing developments at something of a physical distance from parish church. And before very long, Madeleine became very much aware that there was something that the life of the parish church was not quite reaching. And her involvement with what you might call the routine outreach of the parish church became rather more complicated. She was very determined that she was not going to go off on her own, not going to start some kind of independent initiative in rivalry to the parish church, but she writes with some feeling that all the good works of the parish remained at arm's length from the real challenges of life in the back streets of Ivry. So increasingly, she and her colleagues withdrew from those routine works of charity in the parish. It felt a bit too much top-down for her. She wanted to be more deeply identified. And that's how she embarked on the route which was finally to see her in the 1940s as the Director of Social Services, as we would call it, in Ivry, under that extremely suspicious communist administration. She records in her letters an early experience which brought this home to her, where she and one of her sisters went to visit the house of a dying man and brought with them a little bouquet, so to speak, in the shape of a cross to leave. And this had caused great offence in a proper French laïque household, where any signs of Catholic piety were essentially signs of class treachery. And Madeleine writes about how she had discovered in that moment that she needed to start by listening, by following the rhythm, walking at the pace of those she was seeking to minister to, rather than forcing that pace and insisting on outward conformities and traditional pieties. Another occasion that she records is taking some second-hand clothes to a flat in the Ivry area, and having handed them over to a child at the door of the flat, hearing the door of the flat opened as she walked down the stairs and seeing her clothes being flung down the stairwell after her by the child's mother, who said, "You think we're only worth second-hand rubbish?" And that was another moment of insight and conversion for her in her ministry in Ivry. And I mention those little vignettes from her letters and her journals because it gives you some sense of the radical challenge she was experiencing during that period. In the 40s and 50s, she withdrew from full-time social work and essentially embarked on something like a full-time ministry of writing, speaking, witnessing alongside the deep contemplative life which she and her colleagues had fostered. She's sometimes been called a French version of Dorothy Day, and there's a great deal in common between her and that extraordinary and great lady and the Catholic worker movement in the United States. They never met, so far as I know, but there's clearly a convergence of vision. But there is something unmistakably, if I'm allowed to say this, unmistakably French about Madeleine. A sort of lightness of touch, an anarchic sense of humour, which comes across vividly still in the photographs of her that survive, but also in a great deal of her writing. And her writing combines that rather light-hearted, sometimes satirical, sometimes just absurd and bubbling over spirit, with a real intensity of devotion to the person of Jesus, and a sense of the inexorable calling to sacrifice in prayer. One of the things that I find most attractive, most irresistible about her, is that profound seriousness about her calling and the profound lack of seriousness about pretty well everything else. She doesn't take herself in the least bit seriously, and yet she takes God in Christ as seriously as possible. And I think that's quite a good mix. So she begins to have a reputation in the 40s and 50s as a writer, sometimes as a controversialist. She was a great supporter of the worker priest movement, and very much outraged when the Vatican came down on that movement in the early 1950s. At the same time, the person she was closest to in that movement was somebody who himself had great misgivings about the way in which the worker priest movement was developing. And he writes, and she sort of endorses this, he writes about the way in which the worker priest has to be primarily and above all someone who leads a hidden life of prayer, and who is not a worker priest simply as a means to an end of social reformism or anything like that. Not that she's against social reformism or that he and others were, but that there was something about the worker priest movement which was in danger of being rather secularized. Now, she knew that, but at the same time, she was deeply upset and really, I think, deeply disoriented by the decision from Rome and the hierarchy to suppress the worker priest movement, and wrote a brilliant and very sharply worded piece about that, which relates to an issue I want to come back to, which is the question of obedience in her work and her spirituality. She writes in one of her comments about the worker priest controversy that she and others are being told to trust their mother, the church. And she says she has absolutely no difficulty in loyalty to Mother Church. And then she says, and what do we expect from mothers? Do we expect that we always agree with them or they agree with us? Do we expect never to grow up and to be relegated to infantile status throughout our lives? No, if we're taking the church seriously as our mother, we have to take growth and struggle and sometimes disagreement seriously as well. And it's a strong statement which reflects both her unfailing loyalty to the church as community and as institution, and her unfailing commitment to pushing against what she regarded as infantilizing tendencies. And having mentioned that question of obedience, let me unpack that a little bit further, because that's the point at which I think we have a little bit of a bridge into the Benedictine world. As we all know, the Benedictine rule begins with that clarion call, ausculta, listen up, as the Americans say. And quite clearly, for Madeleine, obedience was at the heart of everything she did, but an obedience to the will of God in the circumstances that surrounded her. I've said that she tried her vocation with the Carmelites, and that particular Carmelite tradition that goes back to Brother Lawrence, 17th century, the practice of the presence of God and the acceptance of the circumstances of daily life as embodying the will of God for you, that clearly had gone very deep in her. And that's something she returns to pretty frequently in her writing. But here's one way in which she puts it, and I've always found this a particularly powerful summary of how she understands obedience. What do you do, she says to her sisters, as it were, what do you do when you haven't actually got an abbess or a mother superior to tell you what to do? Well, your obedience is then a deep, selfless attention to what is actually being demanded of you by circumstances moment by moment. So she says, your religious superior is the telephone that rings, the key that won't work, the bus that doesn't come. That's your religious superior. You are obedient to the frustrations and the pressures of daily life. You obey and you pick up the phone. You obey and you don't simply swear and kick the door when the key doesn't work. If the bus doesn't come, the bus doesn't come. Is that the end of the world? No. Pray it through. Sit with it. Routine, weather, other people who need to kill time, she says, people who are wasting your time. It's all a matter of obedience. Give yourself to that. And you are actually doing what the traditional disciplines of religious life are looking for in the vow of obedience. And that, I think, connects with another very deep theme in her spirituality, which is, I think, what I'd call expectancy. What's the attitude with which you approach the people among whom you're ministering? Not, she says, tolerance, not a sort of exasperated sigh that you suppress and get on with it as a duty, but expectation. Here in this person, God is waiting for you. And you should expect to find God waiting for you in the person you're with. So the poor around her, those living in the strained and demanding circumstances of Ivry at that time, they're not to be tolerated, she says, but to be awaited, to be approached with expectation, to be known as persons in the fullest sense, and to await and expect and respect who they are, what they are, to relate to them as persons, to relate to their uniqueness. That is how you open yourself to God in those circumstances. And that is how, again, you obey God in your ministry to and with them. And that's what I mean by saying that obedience is so often a unifying theme in her work and in her witness. She speaks elsewhere, in a very interesting way, of spirituality, not a word that she uses, not a word that I'm very fond of, I must admit. She speaks of the spiritual task, the spiritual life, as what she calls collecting up the clues, the hints, the openings and invitations. The person living in the Spirit, as she says, harvests everyday experience, gathers it together so that it can become fully fruitful. And it's another aspect, you might say, of that concern with obedience, waiting, the sense that there is something pressing towards a harvest, a fullness, a fulfillment all around you. And what you have to do is just keep your eyes ceaselessly open for that in awaiting, expectation. And again, I think of other figures of her own era, not least of her very near contemporary Simone Weil, and what Simone Weil writes about attente de Dieu, waiting on God, and the attention, the selfless or self-marginalizing attention that you have to give to the facts of the world around you in order to grow. Again, I don't think they were aware of each other, but there's a kind of convergence at some level going on there. So, in all this, how did she come to terms with the calling to prayer? She says very powerfully at one point that the silence of contemplative prayer is what allows you, in relation to others, to give the gift of yourself, not selfishness gift-wrapped. That's the contrast she draws. Give the gift of yourself, not selfishness gift-wrapped. In other words, the giving of yourself is not, so to speak, going around believing you are God's gift to everybody, that is, you are the solution, and you, therefore, are the real story. Silence helps you park all of that fantasy about yourself, your white savior complex, and all the rest of it, so that what you give is just who you are. And in giving who you are in that spirit, then you give God's love, not just yours. And that's a crucial transitional insight for her. God's love, not just yours. Or rather, yours as it's been sort of simmered on the fire of God's love, so that it can be poured out in proper clarified form. And behind it all, there's another image that she uses, which I think is, again, very powerful. That we stand between two great gulfs, two great abysses. There's what she calls the measurable gulf that is the world's rejection of God, and the unmeasurable gulf of the mysteries of God himself. The measurable gulf of the world's rejection of God. The world's rejection of God is not infinite. It's as if the world can't really quite manage to reject God. Sooner or later, you're going to run out of the energy you need to reject God, because God is pretty persistent. Because on God's side, there's the unfathomable gulf, the unfathomable abyss of that divine love. In terms of her theological vision, it's very interesting that she was read with great enthusiasm by at least some of the theologians of the great French theological revival in the 30s and 40s, the Nouvelle Théologie, the new style of theology, which broke through the rather frozen scholastic world of Catholic theology at that time and reunited the themes of theology with the reality of spirituality, recovered the Greek fathers, for example, and integrated some of the theological speculation going on with the life of contemplative prayer. And so a great figure of that era, like Henri de Lubac, who is, for my money, just possibly one of the two greatest Catholic theologians of the 20th century. De Lubac was a great enthusiast for Madeleine's work and witness. And de Lubac's great friend and ally, the other really great theologian of the century, Hans Urs von Balthasar, actually wrote a preface to one of Madeleine's books, and in that preface talked about the distinction between the perfect divine love that she was writing about and all varieties of ideological program, whether right-wing or left-wing. There's something radically other, something radically deeper going on, says Balthasar. And for Balthasar and de Lubac as theologians, Madeleine's contrast between that measurable gulf of the world's rejection and the unmeasurable gulf of God's love, that connected quite closely with what they both believed and argued about the need to go back to a sense of the inexhaustibility in us of the image of God. De Lubac's great book, Surnaturel, on the supernatural, is really all about that, about the fact that whatever we do, we can't actually extinguish the divine image in us, and there is always a sort of homing instinct in the human heart towards the unfathomable love of God. Madeleine is really just putting all that into practice. She wrote in what's possibly her best-known book about being simply a person in the street. Nous les gens de la rue, we the people of the streets. And she's not thinking of street people in the sense of homeless people, but what we used to say in terms of the man in the street or the man on the Clapham omnibus in those old and pre-feminist days. But les gens de la rue just means the people on the Clapham omnibus, the people around you. And she's repeatedly saying that the church's witness and the church's responsibility is to les gens de la rue, the people of the street. And that can work itself out in any number of ways, not all of them terribly easy for the institutional church to cope with, but get used to it. God is at work, to be expected, to be anticipated wherever you turn, and your obedience to God, and therefore your obedience to the church, is bound up with a particular kind of unself-regarding attention you give to the need around you. The telephone that rings, the key that won't work, the bus that doesn't come. She knows enough about St. Augustine to recognize the old image that love is like a weight. Amor meus pondus meum, says Augustine. My love is my weight, the weight that pulls me down to where I belong. The gravity that anchors me in God, ultimately. And that love, says Madeleine, is a weight that drags us down to the depths of the earth. The love of God is heavy enough to pull us down into those places where there seems to be desolation or despair. A desert, she says, where we are handed over to God. But we accept that pulling down to the depths in trust and expectation. We find solitude in unexpectedly crowded and pressurized places. The solitude of a bus journey, the solitude of a walk through the city. And in that solitude, once again, we experience the silence that steadily strips away the gift-wrapped selfishness that she is so concerned about. And that means, as we walk in silence and solitude, as we sit on the bus in silence and solitude, we are in that moment giving over our faces, our hands, our voices, our presence, for Christ to use in touching others. So that's a sketch of some of what I think are the great governing themes of Madeleine's spirituality, especially as it develops in the 40s and 50s. She didn't write anything very systematic about this. She wrote endless letters, lots of journals. She corresponded at depth and length with her spiritual directors, with the priests who helped look after the parish and others who had oversight of a larger project. And she loved to write in the form of little aphorisms rather than enormous systematic treatises. She doesn't give too much of a clue of where she's finding her influences, though she does interestingly mention that Charles de Foucault was a major presence in the background for her. Again, somebody who, as a convert to Catholic Christianity, had sought out more and more obscurity, silence, poverty, spending his life as a hermit in the Sahara and giving his life there when murdered by local tribespeople. So, in a way, to try and put all this together as Madeleine's teaching is a bit of a cheek, because it's not something that she herself very much wanted to do, and she would not have welcomed, I think, anybody trying to reduce her insights to a tidy shape. But I think it is a helpful thing as we read her, just to be aware of some of these linking themes, these echoes of consistency and continuity in her writing, and especially the way in which those themes of obedience and attention come through. The obedience to the circumstances around you, that expectant and positive attention which waits for God in every human face that turns up. And behind it all, that sense of the two gulfs, the two abysses, or what she elsewhere calls the two darknesses, the darkness of the human heart and the darkness of God's infinite light. That old paradox of mystical theology, which says that there is so much light, so much radiance and intensity and energy of being in God, that its effect on us is blinding. It comes across to us as dark. But before I finish, I just wanted to share with you some other bits of Madeleine, because my first encounter with her was when somebody sent me a translation of this book of hers, The Little Monk, which is a selection of these little aphorisms that she particularly liked. I have to say, I wish that this book were not disfigured by a lot of rather trivial cartoons of little monks, because, as you see from the cover, gives a slightly twee sense to what she's writing. And actually, this is spiritually very tough stuff, and also very funny. These aphorisms she wrote over many years, and this is just a selection of them. And she did indeed call them le petit moine, Alcido le petit moine, Alcides the little monk in French, because she imagines this unobtrusive, rather uncharismatic little monk trying to live out the religious life, and actually at one point becoming a religious superior. So some of these aphorisms are about authority and how you exercise authority in community. As I say, somebody sent me this when I was Archbishop of Canterbury, when it had just been translated into English. And as I read it, I thought, this is exactly the gift that God has designed for an archbishop to keep on his desk and read daily. And for the rest of my time as Archbishop of Canterbury, I had this book on my desk and would pick it up literally daily, just to see what God had to say to me through Madeleine on that particular day. Now, the trouble with the book is that if I start reading extracts from it, we'll be here all night, because I'll need to get through the entire book. It's all massively quotable. But let me just give you a flavour of some of what she says here. Here she is writing about how you cope with giving advice to people. It's important to give advice and to challenge misbehavior. It shows no respect of humanity to let your brother behave like a fool, she says. It shows no respect of humanity to let your brother behave like a fool. But when you say to your brother, I'll take charge of your bundle, he'll be happy. But when you say, I'll take charge of you, he won't. Thinking about community life, she says, keep in mind that just living with you may serve as enough penance to get somebody into heaven. Here's a very poignant little reflection under a section called The Ordeals of the Ordinary Believer. What you choose to advance your faith will be the very thing that you will hate about the faith. And in brackets, the little monk, after having lived 10 years among his brothers. What you choose to advance your faith will be the very thing that you will hate about the faith. And she goes on. Experience has shown these same words are spoken, yelled, whispered, sobbed by women to their husbands after 10 years of marriage, husbands to their wives on their 10th wedding anniversary, doctors after 10 years of practice, activists after 10 years of protest, missionaries after 10 years of preaching, any believer at the end of 10 years of believing. Certain deviations were observed regarding the time frame. Depending on the case, 10 years may be 7 or 13. But everybody has the impression that it's 10 years. That's a reflection which, again, I think you could take a lifetime unpacking. The idea that the thing that has led you to the most fulfilling and the most enlarging experience has also led you to the biggest burdens and the biggest challenges and sufferings you could have imagined. And she puts in brackets at the end of the whole reflection, that's me on a miserable day. But it's a typically witty, compassionate, and I'd say rather haunting observation. When you finally discover that you're just one of the little people, don't conclude that this makes you special. Learn the art of making war on yourself and the art of making peace with others. If your voice sounds like a bugle, your brother will hate music. Beware of wasting time feeling sorry for yourself. Don't neglect your children in order to curry favour with their Heavenly Father. Don't forget to obey even while in command, and submit to discipline even when nobody's watching. Authority has its limits, love doesn't. Just because you're in a good mood, don't treat your children as if they were too. Don't confuse God's will with your own. Don't forget that weakness is the fear of getting hurt. When people question your character, don't respond by doubting theirs. And on humility, to shine is not the same thing as to enlighten. Beware of how you judge those who don't appreciate you. Put yourself in the shoes of others. Don't make them wear yours. Not a great saint, not a great sinner. Just be one more member of the great community called the Church. Well, as you will gather from that, it's very easy to just go on quoting her. But I think you may be able to see from those little quotes something of how her spiritual insight is rooted in that radical sense of attention, obedience, expectation. That profound awareness of the need to question, to interrogate day by day your own readiness to confuse love with selfishness gift-wrapped. I think she is one of the really, really great spiritual teachers of the 20th century. I'm very glad that she's, as of 2018, she's been declared venerable, and I hope she's en route to canonization before too long. But canonized or not, it seems to me she is a person of rare spiritual transparency and authority. I hope that in what I've shared of her this evening, you will see some of the deep connections with the Benedictine imperative, that ausculta at the beginning of the rule, and also the way in which throughout the rule Benedict draws us back again and again to that same sense of expectancy in regard of every member of the community, that expectation that even the youngest, the shyest in the community will have something significant to say, and that attention that the abbot has to give to every member of the community so that the task they're given to do will be the task that they can do, or draw something out of them. So, although I've no evidence at all that she had any deep connection with Benedictinism as such, I think what the rule is about is very much what she's about, and I hope you'll feel the echoes in what I've been discussing with you this evening. And thank you for listening, and I'll be very glad to take your comments and questions.
Thank you, Rowan. Thank you so much for what a wonderful exposition. You managed to get so many sides of her. I just feel, getting to know her slowly as I have done, that she's like a diamond. She's got so many different facets, and they kind of take time to tease out. I won't go on because I'm aware we've got a number of people here, and I'm sure some of them want to ask you questions. So if you can put your questions, please, in the comments section, then we can find a way to feed them through to Rowan for his attention. The bit that you didn't mention about her was the dancer.
True, yes.
Have you got anything to say about that? I mean, obviously we haven't got any evidence as such, but
well, she was remembered certainly as a young woman as a spectacular and adventurous dancer, as well as a spectacular and adventurous dresser. And the one thing which comes across again and again is what an exceptionally vivid personality she had. And of course, that image of dancing does come across in this as well. When you can't dance, let your soul tango, she says. Let your soul tango. There's a good title for a book about her, I suspect.
Yes. Thank you. Adam, if you can help me out with questions here, I'm not seeing.
Yes, absolutely. So please use the chat for any questions which you've got. We last night, whilst we're waiting for anyone to come forward with questions, last night Jerome talked about obedience, and he focused on that a lot actually, and he called it trust in action. I thought that was a very, very nice description. Do you think?
Yes, I'll vote for that.
Yes, I thought it was a very helpful description of obedience, which is something which I think that we struggle with in today's world, the word obedience. But it was interesting that Jeremy, young man of 23, focused on that as being one of the real spiritual gifts of the rule to help him in his rootedness. So I guess it's interesting that you focus so much on obedience. And do you think that today's listener has some difficulties with that word?
Oh, surely, yes. And I think it's partly because we've taken obedience as, if you like, something to do with the contest of one person's will with another. Whereas I think in the deep places of the tradition, not to mention the deep places of scripture, real obedience is much more like the musician playing what's on the score. You know, it's entering into the reality that is going on around you. And when you're part of an orchestra or a choir, I don't think you don't resent obeying in the sense of listening and entering into that common task, that common work. And I would say we really have to get back to that kind of imagery about obedience, so as to get away from one person's will over another. If the conductor says to the first violinist, "You've got to play that because I say so," the first violinist might well say, well, why should I? But if the conductor says to the first violinist, look, here we both are, together, making sense of this overwhelming reality. Maybe it's a bit more like that.
Which of her books do you recommend as being the one? Obviously, the Little Monk is.
I think that really is the best place to start. But We the People of the Streets is, I think, also a good way in. There's not a huge amount in English translation. There's about, I think, it's over a dozen books in French.
Mm-hmm.
I was very moved by the biography. That was very fascinating to get the whole story. I think you've read a lot of her journals and letters. I haven't really done that, but there are quite a few quoted in the biography, and that is fascinating. Yeah.
That's right. That's the biography by
Man, the American. Yeah.
Yes, that's it. Yes.
I'm sure there's several French ones as well, but that's
yes.
the English side. Yeah.
I have a comment here from John Woodhouse, who says, as we move to a synodal church, she sounds like the ideal saint to encourage us to contribute and listen more carefully.
All for that. I think that's very much a spirit. And I think, again, going back to the imagery that I've just mentioned, and the point that people have made again and again, the word synod comes from walking together on the same road. It's not that somebody is making you do something you don't want to do because they want you to do it, but you're finding ways of keeping each other faithfully in the same direction and the same rhythm.
I've got a question for you here from Judy King. When she started to travel more and participate in conferences, did she miss the direct contact with her local community, and did it affect her prayer life?
I don't know about how it affects her prayer life. I think my sense is that yes, she missed that direct contact greatly. She just very manifestly treasured face-to-face contact all the time. She was very immediately affectionate and warm with people. One of the little details I've come across is, of course, she was a very short woman, barely 5 foot. When one friend came to stay, she would always solemnly put a little stool in front of the friend and get on it to embrace her, just to make sure that she had a proper hug.
That's lovely. Yeah. There's one here that kind of some of this you've covered, I think, but any ideas how to restore the virtue of obedience in conflicted times that do not border on oppression?
Yes, well, I wish I had a simple set of recommendations how to get it right, but it does seem to me that there's a challenge for those of us who have or have had authority in the church to say, well, how do you model it? How does our leadership model that kind of call to obedience? And I think, as this little book indicates, part of that is, does the leader look as if they're being obedient? Does the leader look as if their eyes are on the vision rather than sort of glaring at you until you give way? So I think we can hope and pray for a leadership that does that. I think for many people, the sense that we've had, actually, let's be fair, in the last several papacies, is of a leadership that has genuinely tried to keep looking into the mystery in different ways and different sorts of effectiveness, but it's there. And that's one thing. And then I suppose for those living in one way or another under rule, under discipline, the important thing is, do we convey that the joy of this is like the joy of singing in a choir? It's nothing to do with the sort of masochistic satisfaction, letting somebody else push you around. It's the joy of being part of a productive, harmonious exercise, which you can only do together. But all that is very abstract, how you work it out parishes and schools and monasteries and governments. It's a long job.
Mm. And there's one from Catherine, her two thoughts. Have we accounts of the experience of a personal encounter with her? And then it is striking that you speak of her vivacity and striking presence, but how does this sit with her sense of the gift of ordinariness?
Yes, I think there of somebody like Desmond Tutu, whose irrepressible vivacity was the first thing you noticed about him. And I think probably Madeleine was a bit like him. I'm sure Desmond would have said exactly the same things. How important it is to be ordinary, and yet is one of those people who quite clearly had a great deal of difficulty not being noticed just because he was who he was. But I think what she's constantly saying is, look, don't try to make yourself exceptional. You are exceptional already. Don't struggle. Don't impose it. Live into the gift you're given. And I suppose that's how it happens. And again, in her aphorisms, she'll say from time to time, don't put so much energy into being ordinary with a capital O that you sort of chase your tail, struggling desperately hard to be ordinary, and so drawing attention to yourself.
Yeah. There's a lot there, I think, about authenticity.
Oh, absolutely, yes. There was something from, was it Derek just a moment ago?
I'm not doing very well moving them on this laptop.
In a country where the state is split from the church, how was her work and approach to work in the local community seen or even supported by the state?
Well, yes, as I say, that's one of the remarkable things about the story, that she won the trust of this very hostile, very anti-clerical communist administration in Ivry. And as you know, the levels of anti-clericalism in France were ferocious. So it says a lot that she won that degree of confidence and trust from people who were certainly not disposed to think well of her in the first instance. And initially, she and her colleagues were seen by a great many people in the community and in the administration as, pious meddlers who were, if you like, messing up the secular purity of the communist community in Ivry. So she gets beyond that, and without in the least compromising her allegiance to the church, just makes people believe with complete confidence that she is on the side of that community in all its real needs, and she is not going to force or manipulate.
We have time for maybe one more question. There's one here which has been sent to me directly, which is from Eric, who is partly French, who says that was she associated with the resistance at all? He says he thinks that she was, but he can't find any links to that.
No, to be honest, I've not found any links. I must go and look at the journals and letters again, but I've not found much evidence of that. I suppose the decision to stay in Ivry during the occupation, the decision to stay alongside the people to whom she was committed, that says something about the difficult choice that would have faced, I would guess, quite a few people at that time.
I think from Mann's biography, what I understood was that she was very sympathetic to resistance people and gave them tacit and sometimes practical support.
Yes.
But she didn't want to lose her position where she was able to help so many people by going completely native.
I think that's exactly it. It's exactly it, and that's why I said that people had extremely difficult decisions to make at that point. So the person I worked on my research, Vladimir Losky, the Russian emigre, he was one of those who had to take the decision to flee Paris when the Germans arrived, because he had a Jewish wife, he and his family would have been instantly vulnerable. On the other hand, of course, that other great contemporary of Madeleine's, Mother Maria Skobtsova, the great Russian nun and social worker in Paris, she stayed and she was killed for her, because of her identification with the Jews.
Yeah. Terrible times.
Terrible.
Rowan, thank you so much. You packed so much in there. And such a wonderful opening out to us of Madeleine's very many attributes. And I think she's someone we need to pay a lot of attention to in the years ahead. Thank you very, very much.
Well, it's a joy to talk about her and to pass on.
Well, yeah, that came across so strongly. You know, she's such an infectious person. Even so many years she lives. She really does. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you, Adam. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike.
Thank you, everybody, for coming.
Your wonderful introduction, which was great. And I just say also on behalf of the community, a big thank you to Rowan for coming tonight. This is our second visit by Rowan. He gave us a wonderful talk during our 50th anniversary year about the rule of St Benedict, and we've never forgotten his opening words to us saying, well, you know, you're called the lay community of St Benedict. That's obvious because the rule was written for lay people. We've never forgotten that when you came to see us before. So tomorrow night, we're going to hear from Dr. Scholastica Jacob. Do you want to give a little teaser of that, Mike?
And well, just the Scholastica has been a sister in community with the nuns at Stanbrook, and she's researched their history since leaving at even greater depth. And she's a wonderful communicator, and what she has to say will be historically interesting, but also very relevant. So I would encourage you to come along and hear Scholastica.
So thank you all. Can we all give a big thank you to Rowan, a big wave, a big clap? That would be a very fitting way to end.
Thank you all so much. It's a privilege to be with you.
Thank you
very much. Thank you very much. Thank you.
And see you tomorrow, and have a look at all the blogs and podcasts. Do enjoy it. Have a feast.